Okay, so next we're going to move on to Pranav Johnny. He uses he, him pronouns, and the title of his talk is The Bombs in Vietnam Explode at Home, How MLK Linked Racism, Poverty, and Militarism. So I'm going to kick it off to you.
Thanks so much. Are you going to bring on the PowerPoint on your screen, or is that going to create?
You should have the capability to be, you should be a panelist, so then you can bring it up yourself.
Okay, great. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Okay. I'll stop your time. I know you need all the time.
Oh, no.
While Pranav is doing that, I just want to remind everyone that they can hide non-video participants so that it just keeps it a couple of videos on the screen for you. We have a lot of co-hosts in the background making sure security is okay. So that's why you see a lot of people on the screen if you hadn't hidden the non-video participants.
Okay, I really apologize. For some reason, I thought you might be bringing that on, so I didn't prepare having it accessible. Just give me a sec.
I have it up right now. Let me just, I can just share my screen while you're talking. Give me like 1 minute.
I'm having some sorry, I'm having some issues with the firewall and things like that.
Okay, 1 second. Let me see.
Okay.
Yeah, do you have it?
Okay, oh, you got it?
Annabelle screen sharing, so Pranav, you can use that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Sorry about the thing. So then I'll just say next screen, please, and then we'll go from there. Okay. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody. It was great to hear. Chanel, thanks for the invitation from the organizers, and thanks for putting this panel on. Again, I think the white right did its thing, but it often brings us together with even more confidence and a sense of why we need to keep doing what we're doing. And so I definitely see that with this group, and it's really exciting. So my talk, The Bombs in Vietnam Fall at Home, How MLK Linked Racism, Poverty, and Militarism, is to try to talk about the long history of internationalism and anti-imperialism within the Black struggle over time. And here, in the time we have, I'll particularly look at Martin Luther King in the time of the Black Power movement in 1967, as he's shifting left, the kinds of things he said. Martin Luther King is not the most radical leader we can look to. There are so many people we can look to, but I think we can learn a lot from him as well, and kind of reclaim MLK, for the work of the left and for the current moment, as opposed to let the whitewashers and the racists use MLK against radicals and youth every time people actually try to move. And so just to introduce myself, I'm Pranav Johnny. I use he, him pronouns. I teach at Ohio State. You can follow me on Red Guju if you like. And if we can move to the next slide, please. So, thank you. Yeah, so again, just to take some instances from a recent struggle. This is a photo from a 2005 rally against the Iraq War. And the artist is Aziza Gibson Hunter. And what if you look at the sign, "No Iraqis left me on the roof to die," think of 2005, right? You hear the voice of somebody, you hear Katrina, right? In this sign, "No one left me on a roof to die." But you also hear Muhammad Ali. his words from resisting the draft, right? Which we'll come to later, which is basically what beef do I have with the Vietnamese? And what Aziza said, it was an attempt to make her people, the way she put it, understand the direct correlation between this war and our well-being. Sometimes when US military attacks happen, people say, well, how does that affect us, right? And this whole talk is about people actually saying, no, imperialism does affect us very directly. Next slide, please. In 2014 and 2016, we saw a lot of open expressions of Black and Palestinian solidarity. For people who were around then, it wasn't usual to see tanks on American city streets or to see tear gas being used regularly. Now it's a regular thing, we're used to it. But in 2014, when they used tear gas like that, it was a big deal. And Palestinians were tweeting from their experience under Israeli oppression, right? What do you do when you have tear gas? Those things resonated at that time. You could see flags of Palestine in Ferguson and in the Black Lives Matter movement. In a Black for Palestine group that formed, over 1,100 Black activists, artists, scholars, and students signed the 2015 statement of Black solidarity with Palestine. And so again, this goes back to the 60s, but it's also very much present, and it's something that we need to make sure is part of today's struggle as well. Next slide, please. So another example is Janine Jenkins, who was making 797 at McDonald's in Ferguson, saying, we're fighting for Mike Brown, we're fighting for justice, but at the same time, we gotta think about economics, what's going on in our neighborhood. So this idea that fighting to raise the minimum wage is also a fight against racism. It's a very profound idea, and these kind of movements make us think about it. Next slide, please. So King actually calls in this speech we're gonna look at in some detail, he calls it the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty, right? He puts these three things right next to each other, that these aren't silos, these aren't separate issues, but there's connections between them. And as I said before, this is the MLK we don't learn in school. And when we have to think about 67 and 68, his last years of his life, as a shifting context of the civil rights movement. Next slide, please. And so he says in August 67, if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust evil war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet. Next slide, please. So if we just think about quickly what happens with MLK, of course, we talked about the whitewashers using MLK, acting like they actually care about him, but not really learning his message. There's that. But then I think a confusion happens on the left too, where we think civil rights movement and then Black power. But in fact, Martin Luther King lives until 68, right? And he's influenced by the Black Power movement. In fact, Malcolm X, if you just look at this timeline, is killed in 1965, even before the Black Panther Party is formed. And of course, Malcolm X is an inspiration for it. But just when we think about those timelines, I mean, think about how one movement turns into the other after Jim Crow is abolished in the South and the turn to the urban rebellions in the North. These are, you know, flowing into each other. It's not just two completely distinct periods. And so this time that we're going to talk about, 67, when he says the Beyond Vietnam speech, when he ties these triple evils together, that's under the influence of the Black Power movement and it's his own radicalization. Next slide, please. And so this is the speech I'm going to look at, April 4th, 1967, about a year before he's killed in the beautiful Riverside Church in New York City. Next slide, please. And he calls it a time to break the silence because he says, I was silent. He was against the Vietnam War 3 years before that, but he was concerned. He was concerned because, and his concern was well-founded because after he gave this speech, connecting the civil rights movement to the anti-war movement, people didn't, you know, the mainstream didn't like him anymore. He's attacked in newspapers. He's attacked by more conservative people in his own organization who are like, why are we talking about the war? We're about civil rights at home. But just think about it. This fight against racism right now, Imagine if it was a fight to end racism in the United States, but to keep the US empire. What kind of fight would that be? I mean, you can't even do that. But what kind of fight would that be? Do we want to dominate over the rest of the people of the world? And is that going to bring freedom for people of color in the United States? I don't think so. Anyway, let's go through King's arguments. There's a number of arguments he gives. So one is that war spending is anti-people. And I won't read the full quote, but he says that it looked like we were going to finally get programs to end poverty, but then the war happened and all that money was gone, right? So that's the first point. It actually takes funding. You know, it's basically like a big defund poverty program, right? It takes funding from poverty programs and social programs and puts them into war. So that's the first thing. Next slide, please. The second is that then those poor and working people who haven't been taken care of, then they themselves have to fight for a freedom somewhere else that they don't have. And here, you know, King's lyricism. He says, we were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem, right? So there's the hypocrisy of that. But notice he's still not talking about the Vietnamese. And this is an important thing that comes up in the anti-war movement. We talk about what it does to us, the militarism of the US. But then King starts shifting, what's it doing to the Vietnamese? Next slide, please. Well, he's still talking about us here. But this is really important. He even starts questioning the way he's been talking about nonviolence and violence. He starts distinguishing between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed. He says, as I've walked among the rejected, desperate, and angry young men, I've told them Molotov cocktails and rifles won't solve their problems. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems. Next, please. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. That's a profound thought for an apostle for nonviolence to say that in fact there's violence of the oppressor and violence of the oppressed. Next slide, please. Now he moves to the Vietnamese. They must see us as strange liberators. He talks about how they had fought against the French to free themselves from colonial rule. And what does the US do? Come in and try to reconquer Vietnam in the support of France, right? And he says,
5 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. He says, the Vietnamese people felt they were not ready for independence, and we again felt victim to the deadly Western arrogance that has poisoned the international atmosphere for so long, right? So now the self-critique of Western arrogance. Next slide, please. Now he talks about the genocide of the Vietnamese, right? Now the creation of poverty through war. We must have killed 1 million of them, mostly children, thousands of the children homeless, without clothes. And now look at how the gender questions come in. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers, right? Any righteous movement in the United States that takes gender and sexuality and racism clearly has to be thinking globally as well at what militarism does through these wars. Next slide, please. And now he contextualizes it. The US is on the wrong side of a world revolution. He's talking about US military presence in Venezuela, in Guatemala. Next, please. In Cambodia, in Peru, and how they make peaceful revolution possible by refusing to give up the privileges and pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. Now he's talking about why these wars happen, because it's actually about making the safe world for capitalism, right? And that's starting to come into his language. Next slide, please. And so he's saying these are revolutionary times. The Black struggle of the late 60s was very clear about the fights going on against colonialism in Africa and Asia, and they saw themselves as part of it, right? And King is now saying, we need to support these revolutions. Next slide, please. Now, King is still an American nationalist. He talks about the West initiated much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world, and I've got exclamations there. because I think Native peoples have questions about that, enslaved peoples have questions about that. What kind of revolution was 1776? And he is saying, well, we were the revolutionaries, now we become the arch revolutionaries, and only the Marxists stand for the revolutionaries. Next slide, please. He's a little bit afraid of that. He's saying, but he recognizes communism is a judgment against our failure to make democracy real. And given his politics, he wants to say Western democracy needs to re-embrace the revolutionary spirit. That's where King and I disagree on what Western democracy stands for, but I appreciate his understanding that the failures of Western democracy push people towards communism and Marxism, and I hope that includes many of you. And that's where he says, we need to go out declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. Next slide, please. Now, Ali said it much more clearly, in a way. Man, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word. Why should I go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? Ali was actually ahead of King on this question. Next slide, please. It's around this time too, and I'm coming to the end of my time here, but it's around this time too that you see King shifting directly into the question of class struggle as well. And he says to a reporter, you could say I'm involved in the class struggle. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think he's radicalizing from many different directions. Next slide, please. In the Where Do We Go From Here speech in Atlanta in '67 is the one you can read into. I'm not going to go into it, but just to point to it. Next slide, please. And that's where he talks about these questions about poverty. He says at the end, there are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? Not just that there's poverty, but why is that there that kind of poverty? Next, please. And that's where he says, when you start asking that question, you're asking questions about the whole economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. You begin to question the capitalist economy, right? And so you see King, from what I would call a social democratic perspective, actually challenging and saying the word capitalism as what he's against. Next slide, please. Mass meetings are going on for the Poor People's Campaign, and you can look at his work around that, which is going along. I'm sorry?
1 more minute.
1 more minute, okay. Which is going along with the Memphis sanitation worker strike that he's just supporting. If you can just, I'll probably move quickly, if you can move to the next slide. So the speeches to the, there we go, I'll just stop there. The next one, please, yeah. So the speeches to the striking sanitation workers, we only remember the line about, I've been to the mountaintop and, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But it's in this speech where he talks about those connections to class in a very firm way. So people should check that out at their own time. I'm at the end of my time. I just want to end by saying this, that what King does in this speech, and I think what we have to do, is that internationalism and anti-imperialism is not an add-on to the fight against racism. It's not an add-on to the fight against poverty. It's not just that they're taking money that we could use here and sending them elsewhere. There's a right-wing version of that argument. Who cares about other people? We have problems at home, right? It's not about protectionism. It's that this is a global system and capitalism's looking at home and abroad. They're global, they're very nationalist, but they have a global picture. They're fighting wars everywhere. We have to recognize what's going on, our role in actually opposing that, our role in actually opposing colonialism and economic exploitation abroad, and that being directly connected, as King said, the bombs in Vietnam fall at home. Thank you very much.